up against the timer here. I'll wait for it to press go. Oh, I'm off. Okay, so thanks for having me. Just to say, this is work I'm doing with Adam over there, as well as some other folk. We've got Dylan, who's a recent PhD student of Adam's, who's looking at some zero growth economics, and Professor Andreas Antoniadis from Global Studies as well. Just want to say a little bit about, very quickly, what we mean by fiscal space. I'm sure you're all familiar with what we mean by inflation. Fiscal space is basically how a government might create and allocate funding. There's lots of different definitions of it, but there's a very broad definition that you guys can work with. Okay, so what are we doing? We're basically starting with a very, very simple question. Is there any empirical basis for the claim that fiscal expansion causes inflation? So if a government creates additional money by running a sort of a budget deficit, will that lead to inflation? Because what often happens is government might use fears of inflation to justify running a budget surplus or a budget deficit accordingly. But what you've got to realise, I think, is that whenever a government does spend money, it creates that money. Wherever it taxes, it destroys that money. So you've got a money creation destruction mechanism going on when the government spends and taxes. Alongside that, in the private sector, whenever a bank makes a loan, it creates that money. Whenever that loan is repaid, it's destroyed. So you've essentially got two engines of money creation, and one of them is fiscal expansion. So the question is there an empirical basis that fiscal expansion can cause inflation? So why can we ask this question now? Well, the World Bank have published a couple of very useful databases recently. Ian Cozy, who's currently I think he's the Deputy Chief Economist at the World Bank at the moment, but he took charge of these two papers. So we've got global data sets now, whereas before the data was quite sparse when it came to fiscal space. Inflation data has been available globally for quite a while, and that data goes back to the 70s. The fiscal space data, until recently, has only been sort of published on a country-by-country basis. So to get that all together and have a global data set is quite a big step forward. It must be noted that the fiscal space data is nowhere near as complete as the inflation data, especially for emerging and developing countries, which is something we'll talk about as we go on. So why are we doing it? Okay, well, the motivation is clear, as I've alluded to it. The fear of inflation is often used as a reason for a government to pursue or not to pursue policy. Alongside growth, they're the two big fearmongers that a government might use to justify or not justify its choices. Opportunity. As I've said, this data set is now available. We've now got global data on fiscal space. Alongside the global data on inflation, it allows us to come at this from an empirical point of view. Traditionally, economics hasn't really done that, and it's still kind of clinging on to sort of ideas that are quite old. And more importantly for me, it's the bigger picture. So I'm motivated to do this work, as is Adam and Dylan and everyone in this team, by an existential dread of climate change and our inability to face it. And there's this growing body of beyond growth research. And I put that in quote marks because there's not really a fixed term for it, but it's a multidisciplinary cross-collaboration of people from all different walks of life who are kind of united about sort of trying to work towards policy and practice for a safe and just world. I haven't got time to go into what I mean by beyond growth entirely. This image many of you might be familiar with. Kate Raworth published it, the donut of the safe and just space for humanity. And it's a way of thinking about how we might move towards a new idea of working together and living within planetary boundaries while ensuring there's a social force that people don't go below it. What it does really nicely is it gives a purpose to economics. So now economics and the policy that goes with it is there to keep us in that donut, keep us in the safe and just space for humanity. We've got ecological ceiling. If we overshoot it, we've got things like climate change, chemical pollution. Then we're in the danger zone, in the red zone. And below, we've got social foundation. If we drop below it, then people are not getting peace, justice, political voice, etc. Recently, Raworth and one of her colleagues published a paper in Nature last year looking at the current state of the donut, and we can see we're overshooting and undershooting everywhere. So we're not in a particularly great space. What this paper does, it's quite a nice paper to go and have a look at. She breaks it down into country clusters. So we can see here, this is the richest 20% of countries. This is the poorest 40%. So not even cherry picking the poorest, it's the poorest 40%. So we can see the space that these poorest 40% have to grow into and to deal with all of their social shortfalls compared to the richest 20 who, justice and political voice are still kind of lacking a little bit. But generally, we've got our social floor in place, but at the expense of, you can see, huge overshoots there. So this is the motivation. And back to what we're doing, it's about like people from all disciplines doing tiny little things, trying to edge things along. So this is a very humble piece of work that we're doing. And I must say it's very in preliminary stages right now. But all we're trying to do is to come up with some empirical basis for what actually does drive inflation. And then maybe in some policy discussion at some point, this can be used to maybe argue against one policy or another. So very briefly, the fiscal space data set has 23 variables. Very quickly, I'm just showing you a couple of scatter plots. We've got inflation up the left, or at least consumer price index up on the vertical axis. Fiscal balance, that's just the difference between expenditure and revenue. We can see that there's not really much pattern there between the state of fiscal space and inflation. And I have capped inflation at 10% for this graph. In the database, there are hyperinflation things, but we're just trying to look at regular inflation, non-scary inflation, rather than when it goes bonkers, which is a completely different mechanism and needs a different analysis. A second metric here, this is general government gross debt. So this is all of its liabilities, basically. So that's as a percent of GDP, of course. That's complete government liabilities versus inflation. Again, there's not that much pattern visibly. But, let's have a little look at what we can find when we look at the data more carefully. So all we're doing here is we're using some Granger causality tests on the 23 variables for 3 lags. I'm running out of time, so I'll assume you know what Granger causality is. But very quickly, causality is misleading in this sense. That's a deep philosophical question. Really, it's about forecasting. So just be careful with the word causality. Okay, and I've got 1 minute. So when we look at all data, these are of the 23 variables, these are the ones that are Granger significant, okay? It's quite interesting. We included USA inflation and unemployment in there as well as the 23 metrics. But we can see that actually domestic credit to the private sector, that's money creation by the banks, and general government gross debt, which is all the liabilities that the government hold, are significant. Now, whoop-de-doo, a quick correlation plot. But what's really interesting to me is we can use this data to look at different types of economies. So this data includes advanced economies or extractive economies, the global north, whatever you want to call it. And these are the metrics that were Granger significant there. The top 5 are all heavily correlated. They're essentially the same kind of thing, just different types of fiscal balances. And then we've got debt ratings, USA inflation and unemployment. And you compare that to emerging and developing countries or the global south or the exploited economies, and you see a completely different list of things that are Granger significant. Now, it must be noted that the data is quite sparse when it comes to emerging and developing countries compared to advanced economies, so that needs to be taken into account. But you can see what we've basically got is different types of inflation. That's what we really want to get at. So this is the key question moving forward. Can we identify different types of inflation? This is what we want to do, a qualitative analysis of inflation, rather than just inflation is one thing, it's caused by one thing. What we are proposing is there are different types of inflation, different regimes, and caused by different things. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Perfect. See you later.
Well, I have one to start us off.
Okay, no.
So what's the business with the USA inflation in there? So is it just driving everyone's inflation positively? Is that what?
Well, we need to look into it more. But like we included it as an additional variable later on. First, we started just with the fiscal space, and then we've started adding additional variables. And yeah, we believe, and it looks like the data supports it, that the USA is a large driver of inflation, and people follow suit. And it's about import-export as well. So some of these metrics include like just domestic kind of measures over an import-export. Another thing we want to look into more closely is which developing countries are linked to the dollar. So some are absolutely pegged to it, and there's going to be a much heavier correlation there versus ones that are not, are just kind of doing business. Yeah. Yes, please.
Do you foresee there to be kind of many founding kind of variables that are going to affect your analysis?
But we want to include as many different variables as we can going forward. So Dylan comes from an economics background, bless him, and we're going to include as many as we can get. Just something to say that the data is quite poor. It's aggregated at the annual level. So we want more granular data. Like a lot of this data is proprietary. So there's quite a battle to get people to release more granular data, ideally with like complete transaction networks, things such as that. And there's a big inequality between the data that's available in the global north versus the global south. So we need to make sure that we're being kind of like fair when we're collecting this data. But I think that one of the key bits of analysis is a comparison. And we go back to the old, don't overshoot and undershoot. And what we need is a different understanding and a way of sort of understanding the economics of the developing world versus the economics of the developed world. And we think that this is an angle that we might be able to explore.
Okay, good one.
I guess there's kind of how far back is the data?
Inflation to the 70s, fiscal space to the 90s. But 90s is mainly for advanced economies. It's sparse for emerging developing. Yeah, I guess you could say one, like Thatcher Reagan, and it's been the same ever since, well, until Trump blew it all up. But yeah, is that.